It is Wednesday, January 31, 2007. This is part of the Rutgers program on the governor, compiling the Brendan T. Byrne archive on the history and career of the Byrne administration and of Governor Brendan T. Byrne. I'm Don Linky. This morning we'll be conducting our second session, an interview with Robert E. Mulcahy III, who served as Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Institutions and Agencies and subsequently as the Commissioner of the newly formed Department of Corrections in Governor Byrne's first term, and then at the beginning of the second term was named by the Governor as Chief of Staff in the Governor's office. He subsequently was appointed by the Governor as the Chief Executive Officer of the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority, and currently is the Athletic Director of Rutgers University. Bob, during our first session, we brought you up generally to the beginning of the Governor's second term when you became Chief of Staff. But we also flipped around a little bit. You talked about taking Speaker Christopher Jackman out for lunch and an extended session of drinks over lunch to try to get his support for the administration's bill to create New Jersey Transit. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on those sort of incidents and also the other legislators that you dealt with and the different styles and personalities they had and how you had to sort of change your approach to win them over on particular issues.
I think the way to start this conversation is that when we started the second term, we created an administration bill list. And as I indicated in prior testimony or conversations, we instructed all the cabinet officers to make sure that this was the only thing they were seen lobbying for. And among those items were things like the Pinelands, the administrative law judge bill, the takeover of New Jersey Transit, or at that time public service, which became New Jersey Transit, the bus system. In the process of doing that, we had to work with legislative leaders as well as the legislators themselves. And one of the things that I tried to do was to be fair to anybody who came in. And there were many times legislators would come into the office and would be concerned about a particular bill because they had concerns that they really felt they couldn't vote for it. And my approach to that was, if I don't need your vote for the majority, that's fine. If I need it, then I'm going to call you. But if I don't need it, remember that I have an IOU the next time we have a bill that's going to be passed that we need your vote on. So I think it was sort of a fair approach. In fact, one of the interesting conversations I had with Senator Ferrand from Hunterdon County, who was a Republican, and at one point he remarked to me, "I've gotten more of my bills signed than anybody else." And it was sort of the way we approached things. If the things were right and fair, then we attempted to find a way to get them done. Now, there were times that I was accused by the Democratic Party of not paying enough attention to the party. I admit that, and not enough attention to strengthening the party. But I always felt that the calling to government was a little bit above party politics when you got to this level, and that frankly, while we had to pay attention to the politics and to the party, our calling was to try and do what we thought was best for the people of New Jersey. And we tried to follow that context. And I would say that one of the great things about dealing with Governor Byrne was that he was concerned in a similar way about the things that were best for the state. There were personalities with all of the legislative leaders, whether it was Joe Merlino or whether it was Chris Jackman, who was then Speaker of the Assembly. Their different perceptions of being acting governor when the governor went out of state, and the fact that we'd send him the car and the trooper, but really didn't want him to get involved in any of the actions of government. And part of my job when I stayed behind was to make sure that didn't happen.
Well, expand on that a little bit. Joe Merlino, of course, was the Senate president, the counterpart in the Senate of Speaker Jackman in the Assembly. Well, how were they different as personalities, and how were they similar?
Well, I think that Senator Merlino was very passionate about certain issues. I think that Speaker Jackman was much more pragmatic. Speaker Jackman was a labor leader. He was a product of Hudson County. And I think that given those two kinds of backgrounds, that made him very pragmatic, or he wouldn't have gotten where he is. Senator Merlino came out of Mercer County. He had a passion for certain issues that he felt very strongly about, and I think that guided him to a great deal, at least in great measure, to where he wanted to take issues. However, I think that we were able to get the leadership in a room and generally be able to agree on what we wanted to do. Give you an exception. Toward the close, I think I talked about this in an earlier session, and that was the day we tried to pass the administrative law judge bill. And the fact that the Democratic caucus was chaos, and when we couldn't get the votes past 35, I simply said in fact, you almost had to scream there to get yourself heard. And I said, well, we'll go get the Republicans, and we did. We were able to maintain a very, I think, strong relationship with the Republicans because we treated them with respect. And I always felt that way. And I felt that they were elected from their districts, and sometimes the greatest difficulty you can have when you have large majorities is that people feel they have the opportunity to go and do whatever they want to do, and sometimes we had to demonstrate that we could find other ways to get bills passed.
Now, you mentioned Senator Ferran, a Republican. Who are some of the other Republicans that you remember and some of their special interests and personalities?
I'm trying to remember which ones were there as opposed to who's there now.
Well, how about on the Democratic side? Who were some of the others that you had frequent
you
contact
led at
with?
some of this, right?
Sure.
Well, you had Senator Greenberg from Essex, who subsequently became a judge.
And was a former law partner of Governor Byrne.
Was a former law partner of Governor Burns.
Senator Russo was also fairly prominent in that.
Senator
session.
Russo then became, he was the majority leader in the Senate. John was a big Notre Dame guy. That's what he seemed to have a preoccupation with.
But Bill Hamilton.
Bill Hamilton was another one of the leaders in the Assembly, like Alan Karcher, who had very strong beliefs about what they wanted to get done. When I defined or described Jackman as practical and pragmatic, I would say that Bill Hamilton and Alan Karcher were much stronger in their beliefs of what they wanted to get done, as opposed to being. I mean, there were times when they get pragmatic, but there were a lot of times when they'd stand for what they believe.
Describe a little bit the process of selecting the legislative leadership and to what extent the Byrne administration tried to influence those decisions.
Frankly, I don't think we did an awful lot to influence the decisions. There would be meetings and there would be discussions, but I go back to things like the Hudson County prosecutor, and the day that the governor sent me down to meet with the leader of Hudson County, Harry Scheel, and the mayor of Jersey City, Tommy Smith, and tell them that they could not have the person for prosecutor they wanted, and they went ballistic. And the governor had said, look, if we can't get one appointed, then I'm going to put a deputy attorney general in there. And it was one of those meetings that you always remember, because it was the personification of Hudson County in those days.
Tommy Smith was a very colorful character. Expand a little bit on your memories of him.
Well, Tommy was a very colorful character. He got elected mayor of Newark, and Jersey City, I'm sorry, and he, I guess, became state senator too.
Wally Shield.
Yeah, Wally became I guess Wally was the leader and the senator in Hudson, and the mayor was kind of the power. And I remember one night we had, it had to do with when Dick Leone was running for U.S. Senator.
Against Bill Bradley.
Well, before it quite got to that. This was in the primary. And the governor told me he wanted me to come with him to a meeting with Wally Shield and Tommy Smith. And Frank Guarini. Frank Guarini wanted to run for senator also and was looking for their support. So the governor deliberately took us all to the eating club at Princeton that he belonged to. This was to create an atmosphere and an awe among these people from Hudson County, as he subsequently told me. We finished dinner and we returned to Morven, to the library. And the first thing the governor said to them was, I know you're concerned about the Jersey City Medical Center, and this is what we're going to do. And he outlined it. And then he said to them, is there anything else you want to talk about? So then what it did was it took away their leverage. Mm-hmm. And then put them in a position of asking for something with not having any leverage left. And it was one of the great lessons to me on how you could make the so-called political deal and not have it be a deal. Because then they subsequently asked about Frank, and the governor was pretty strong on backing Dick Leone for a lot of reasons. And I remember the morning that we met in Morven in the library with Bill Bradley, when Senator Bradley came to seek his support. And he went through, it was the three of us sitting there, and he went through a variety of reasons why he should be the U.S. Senator from New Jersey. And toward the end of the conversation, Governor Byrne turned to me and he said, what do you think? And I looked at Bill and I said, you know, Bill, one of the things that strikes me here is that you, who really are not a New Jersey guy, have come into New Jersey, think you have all the answers for what should be here. And someone like myself who sat here and worked through all of these issues really has no capacity to have a say in this. And I think he was taken back by that. And it sort of gets to the issue of you move into a state and run for senator. Because the speculation had been he'd either go to Missouri, which was his home, or come to New Jersey because he played basketball at Princeton. And it was one of those few times, I guess, when I got to express my own feelings about situations like that. And as we all know, the governor did back Dick Leone out of loyalty. I think that was the right decision at the time. It probably wasn't the most politic of decisions, but this was Brendan Byrne.
And you think he did that solely out of loyalty, knowing that Bill Bradley probably would defeat Dick Leone in the primary?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true.
Now, did your comment to Bill Bradley at the time sour your relationship in subsequent years?
No, and an interesting thing happened. One of our sons, Matthew, spent his sophomore year as a page in the U.S. Senate, specifically thanks to Senator Pete Williams at the time. And during his year there as page, Senator Bradley was very gracious and kind to him, and I always respected that, and I've always had a good relationship with Bill. I think that he respected the fact that I had my own strong thoughts about this, and I respected the fact of what he stood for.
Now, you mentioned Mayor Smith of Jersey City. Another contemporary mayor at the time was Ken Gibson in Newark. Talk about your recollections of Ken Gibson.
Well, Ken Gibson, I really knew through Harold Hodis. When I asked Harold to join the governor's office as the deputy chief of staff, he had been working for Mayor Gibson, and that's really how I got to meet and know Ken Gibson. My recollections of my dealings with Ken Gibson was he was always pretty straightforward with me. I go back to the time as corrections commissioner. I did an interview here at Eagleton with Herb Jaffe on the radio show that he used to have every week. And it was during the course of the interview, he asked me a question about citing a new prison, and forgetting that the interview would be on the radio before any of this became public and in a way that we would put it out, I made the mistake of saying that our next thought was to place a prison in Newark, in between Newark Airport and the city, which would be somewhat close to the Ironbound. I was very rudely and quickly castigated by the leaders in the Ironbound section of Newark, and particularly who was the guy who ran? Who was the guy with the gun?
Imperiale, Tony Imperiale.
Yeah, particularly by Tony Imperiale, who told me that he would make Kiowa Towers look like child's play if this happened. So I went to see Mayor Gibson in Newark and asked him about this, and he said to me, Bob, he's absolutely correct in what he would do. I would suggest you forget about it. So I forgot about it. As you now know, they do have the Northern State Prison, which isn't far from the site that we were talking about at the time. But I think it points out that there's a time and the circumstances have to be right to do those kinds of things. Nobody wants an institution anywhere near their home.
Mm-hmm. Of course, Tony Imperiale was a fairly prominent activist in the Italian community in Newark, and also was elected as a state senator.
Without question.
Let's talk on some of the major issues that you faced in the second term. One of the issues, and I was involved fairly heavily in, was the Pinelands program. It was an issue that the governor initiated fairly personally. Most of the staff, I think, had quite a bit of skepticism about the politics and doability of what he wanted to get done. But to me, it was always sort of a indication of his personal commitment and perseverance when he set his mind on enacting a policy. What are your recollections?
Well, I think you're right about that, Don, and you know, this was one of those cases. I mean, this is a very big action because it covers almost, I guess, 20% of the state. And you're right, people never thought this could get accomplished. The strategy was to pass the bill in the Senate because we felt that we could get it passed there, particularly because of Senator Merlino and his leadership. And then we would have to struggle to get it done in the House. Because meanwhile, we were being sued, as you recall. There was a lawsuit that got all the way to the Supreme Court. And the thing that I remember most vividly about it is the bill became scheduled for a vote in the Assembly on a Monday morning. On Friday, Harold and I conferred with Dick Coffey, who was the executive director of the Democratic majority in the Assembly. And he told us that there were not enough votes to pass it. They also told us that there was going to be a move to recommit the bill for amendment. And if that happened, which they thought would happen, which was the the easy way out for legislators not to have to vote on the issue at that particular time, that they would win that vote to recommit. And we didn't have the votes to stop it. So Harold and I spent the weekend calling every assemblyman. There were some assembly people who said, I want to vote for the environment in the Pinelands if it comes up, but I don't want to get caught on the recommittal. There were about 4 or 5 of those. And we promised them that if we got the motion defeated to recommit the bill for amendment, that we would have enough time delay between that motion and the passage of the bill that we would bring them in with the state police and give them time to come in and vote. And if they couldn't support us on the motion to recommit, then it would be better that they stayed home. We felt after our calls that day that we had a 36-33 majority to prevent the bill from being recommitted. When I got to my office on Monday morning, I got a call from Chief Justice Hughes, and he asked if I would come over to see him. He said he had a couple of personnel matters. I came into Chief Justice Hughes' office. He talked about a couple of things, and then he said to me, "Are you going to pass the bill today?" So I went through exactly what I had related here and what Harold and I had done to align the votes and make sure we had it. And he turned to me and he said, "If you can get it passed today, it will make Judge Passman's job a lot easier. Here's the phone number on the phone next to my bed. Call me at any hour." So I looked at him and I didn't say anything, and I went back and I saw the governor and I related the conversation to the governor, and I said, "I guess, Governor, we better damn well get this passed today or we're in trouble," because that would sort of symbolize that perhaps Justice Passman was going to write an opinion on the case that was not favorable to us.
And of course, the executive order that the governor signed imposed a moratorium on construction in the Pinelands. And there were serious questions which were debated in the litigation that Justice Passman was writing the opinion on concerning the constitutionality of the governor's powers to issue this moratorium through executive order. And in fact, Attorney General, or then Attorney General Degnan, has said when his staff looked at it, they didn't think they had a chance of defending the executive order before the court. So that's interesting in terms of the sort of back-channel communications that you had with the Chief Justice.
Well, I think, too, and I know, Don, you had a lot to do with this, but it's indicative of the strategy that was employed here by doing the executive order and getting out front on the issue and then getting it passed in the Senate to apply as much pressure as we could in the House. It was almost like a dual-front strategy. So that day, to finish the story, we had the people we wanted, and the debate continued. It was almost a filibuster. And we had people sleeping in the governor's office on the couches and so on. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, the speaker called me and he said, "The motion for recommittal is coming up now." We won that battle, 36-33. So then I asked the speaker to have a 2-hour recess so that we could deliver on our promise to bring certain legislators back. In one case, I remember one of them was a municipal prosecutor, and we'd given him his word if he went and did his job that night in the municipality, we'd make sure there was time for him to get back. There were other people that we got in. The second problem we had, it was during the gas crisis with the odd even, and we had to call the state police to open the gas pumps. So at about 4:15 in the morning, the Pinelands bill went up, and it passed. And thus ends the saga of how this was probably one of the best strategically planned moves to affect the environment and have a lasting impact that I was involved with. That you could turn around when it was done and say, we accomplished something as a team that will affect the people of this state for a long time. And I think those are the satisfactions that we got out of serving with Brendan Byrne.
And during the process of the debate and passage of the Pinelands legislation, did you ever urge Governor Byrne to compromise, to back off, to try to get a few of those votes which were so difficult to secure?
Well, we would have conversations, obviously, when we talked about this, but he was pretty resolute in what he wanted to get done, and I think it paid off in the end.
Frankly, I recall, and I was involved in the drafting of the first versions of the bill, and one of the major issues was how to draw the line as to where the Pinelands was, because no one quite really knew. And among the people who were doing that drafting, I remember we came across a Rutgers study for the Federal Department of the Interior, I think, that drew this very expansive line, essentially just, I think, for looking at where the water aquifers and so forth were. But it was at least a line. It was a map. And I remember our discussions were, well, this is so huge, let's start with it, with the idea that as the bill got introduced, it would get whittled down to what was the core area, the preservation area in the center of the area, and that would be fine. So we, I think, at that level never expected all this area to be included, and thought that the political process would, through negotiation, narrow it down to a much smaller area. But in fact, that never occurred.
No, and I think what happened is the sides hardened very quickly. So we either going to get it or not get it. And I think the governor's position at that time, as I recall, was if we're going to do something worthwhile, then let it be worthwhile. And I don't remember a lot of haggling over compromises to it. Now there were interesting events. I remember one night, I indicated earlier the governor told the legislative leaders that if I had the authority to work things out with them. One night we passed an urban aid bill, and I couldn't get the votes. In order to get the votes, I had to add some money for some of the rural districts. And when I called him at Morven about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, he said to me, "Well, I'm not going to sign that bill." I said, "Okay, Governor." But 3 or 4 days later, he signed the bill. So, I mean, there were always, one of the great things he did, I think, was to make sure that we always understood what our position was, and certainly not to assume we had more power than we did. And I think that was really what helped make a good working relationship. The other thing was, Don, I think that we put together a team in the governor's office that worked very well together. And our motives were really motives that were generated for our desire to try and do what was best for the people in New Jersey. We may not have always been right, but with people like Stu Pollack and Harold Hodis and you and Tim Carden and other people that were there in the office, Mike Rowe, Jerry English, it was always what do we think is best, and then we try and figure out how to get it done. And I think that's the great legacy that Brendan leaves.
Were there other instances, like with the urban aid bill, where you went out on a limb with the legislature and made a commitment and then had to go back to the governor and say, please back me up on this, when he was reluctant?
There weren't very many. One of the things that we did was many mornings I would stop by Morven before I went to the office. And we'd have a checklist. And it's funny, you get to understand how your leader works. And I might have 20 things on the list. And the way I would ask the questions was, Governor, I'm going to do this and this issue. And some days you could go down the list and get them done. And other days maybe by the second issue he'd be off on something and you'd realize, forget the rest of the list for that day. So, you know, those were some of the little things that took place in the relationships that existed in the office. Now, one of the great people in this whole office relationship was Dottie Seltzer, who was his personal secretary, and she had been the secretary for, I guess, Governor Minor, Governor Hughes, and I think there was one other besides Governor Byrne.
I think those 24 years.
Yeah, 24 years, and she knew the inner workings of everything, and she was a great person to go to talk about things. She sat right opposite me outside my door, and there were many times when we would have conversations, and she would give her insights into how the issues should be approached with the governor.
And there also has been some talk that she was sometimes used as a conduit by the staff when they didn't want to directly talk to the governor or confront him with some bad news or news that they didn't, frankly, feel that they personally wanted to be associated with. Is that true?
Well, I think that's true, and I think it happens with every administration. I would say that there were times that I did have to take bad news into him. Sometimes it was personal, like I remember early on when I think it was his nephew was killed by the machine he was operating up in Morris County, and I had to take that into him, and I remember sitting there with him and his reaction, and then he wanted to be alone. So there were those kinds of moments, and there were a lot of good moments. We could be on the road doing something, and he'd say, "Let's go in this store and look at books," or spur of the moment kinds of things. Now, there was one rule he had that he told me when I became chief of staff. He said, "Bob, you got to understand something. I don't wait for anybody. If I'm ready to go, I'm going. Doesn't matter if it's you, the Attorney General, or whoever." I learned very quickly to eat when we stopped someplace when I first got there, because you never knew when we were going to leave. But I think the thing that I cared most about was that we had such good people who were in the office and in the administration. They were talented, they were moral, they cared about what we were doing, and it made it a pleasure to come to work each day.
Another issue that somewhat went in hand with the Pinelands was Atlantic City and the approval of casino gambling. Now, obviously, that was a very pro-development initiative, while the Pinelands was very pro-conservation. But in terms of the development of South Jersey, they frankly went in tandem. If the Pinelands didn't pass and Atlantic City did, there would have been quite a bit of development pressure to build over the forest lands and the aquifers in the pines. I'd like to talk somewhat about the process of Atlantic City. One of the documents we found in the state archives is a memo that you wrote to the file recounting a telephone conversation you had with Joel Stearns, who was then the attorney for Resorts International, which was seeking the first casino license. Do you recall that conversation and what Joel was trying to do?
Well, I don't recall the specific conversation, although I've seen the memo. I didn't write a lot of memos, as you know, when I was there, for a lot of reasons, which I've continued to follow throughout life, and I think sometimes in public life it's a lot easier. But Joel was one of those individuals that we had a lot of respect for, and he represented resorts, and obviously he had a close working relationship with Steve Persky, who was the senator from Atlantic and the primary architect of the casino bill. People would come into my office, and ask for advice on how to approach certain things with the governor. And part of my role was to advise them how to handle the issues in a way to get it done if the governor wanted it done. And in this case, he obviously was a proponent of what should be there. And I don't think it's anything that people should be stunned at. If you knew the governor loved to go to the racetrack. He only bet $2, but he loved to go to the racetrack. In fact, the matter is, when I was at the Meadowlands and we went to the Kentucky Derby one year, and we had arranged for the seats up in the high society level of the track. The first thing the governor comes to me and he says, "Bob, there are no $2 windows on this floor. The minimum bet's $5." And so I think from his days as prosecutor, when he used to deal with the numbers racket, the fact that he loved to go to the racetrack and bet on the horses, I don't think it was any surprise that he was supportive of this concept because of what he felt it could do. And part of my role in all of these things was to be the interpreter or the intermediary between people that wanted things done and the governor's position on it. And I always looked at it that way. And I think that subsequently some people have lost that feeling that was part of their role. Cabinet officers might come into my office screaming about something. Well, I'm not going to go in and tell the governor that they were screaming at the governor. I have to figure out a way to phrase what they were trying to say if it was critical and relate it to the governor in a way that wouldn't get him emotional about it either. And that I considered part of my role. One of the things that he said to me when I left was that one of the things he was going to miss was my instinct for knowing where trouble was going to come. And I had never quite looked at it that way, but I think that having been told that, and subsequently in later life in the jobs that I'm in, I do have sort of an instinct for where there are potential problems. And so I looked at, Harold was very much involved in the Atlantic City issue because he had an awful lot to do with the legislature at that time. And it was one of those major initiatives that the Byrne administration became known for in an effort to rehabilitate the state. And when you look at the fact today, Don, there was a special on, I think it was Dateline the other night, an hour on Camden being the worst city in America. And you look at the various ratings, and we can wind up with 3 cities in the top or worst 10. We'd have had 4 if Atlantic City had continued to go the way that it had. And you would never have seen any of the economic development that now exists. There are problems with everything you do. People complain about the social problems and so on. But you got to look at life and its practicality and figure out how you can use some of that to be successful for the state. And I think the governor looked at Atlantic City and felt that this was one way, and probably the only way, to take a resort city like that and turn it around.
Now, in his interview, Dick Leone said that he felt so strongly against casino gambling in Atlantic City that he offered to resign during the first term. And that he also said that Attorney General Highland did the same, and they went to the governor and said that, they would like to resign because they couldn't support this. And the governor said, no, you don't have to submit your resignations, and you can speak out publicly. I believe John Degnan, who was the Attorney General in the second term, also said he opposed Atlantic City. How did you feel personally?
I felt personally that it was something that we should do, and that I was not aware that both Dick Leone and Bill Highland had offered to resign over the issue. And I think that's part of what we've talked about in these interviews about people and their commitment to what they thought was right and their strength of conviction. But it was also the governor's ability to keep everybody on board, even when they had their own views on something that didn't necessarily coincide with his, because he knew that in the long run it might not be this issue, but there were 10 other issues where they were helpful to him. And I think that was one of his great strengths, in having the best and the brightest people he could find around him, excluding myself.
In retrospect, with the great benefit of hindsight over the many years that have passed, were there things that could have been done when the Atlantic City legislation and regulations were being implemented in the beginning that hurt development as we came on, or were mistakes made?
I think the biggest issue, and it wasn't because the governor didn't understand this, but was the size of the city limits of Atlantic City and their ability to govern themselves, and the fact that you needed a broader governmental agency that could attract a greater breadth of people. You see the issue being focused again today. And I think one of the problems has been that Atlantic City has not been able to, the government has not been able to deal with the issues. You've seen, 3 mayors go to jail. It was politically we could not get it done at that time, and the decision was made to forgo the effort at that point. But it would have, in hindsight, and I think now people are seeing it, it would be much better to have had a broader governmental base.
Do you recall who the leaders of the political opposition was? Senator Persky opposing a regional agency to oversee development?
Don, I don't recall that specific.
Okay.
I just don't know.
Personally, again, are you pleased with what's happened in Atlantic City, or disappointed?
Well, I think all of us look at Atlantic City, and you have to look at the positives. I think the disappointment I have is that they have not been able to do a better job governing it on a regional basis and being able to take the benefits and bring them to a broader area. I think that requires local leadership, and I think that Senator Persky and subsequently Senator Bill Gormley have been very strong advocates for their area. They're very bright legislators, and I think they've done a good job, and I think they all understand the dilemmas that are faced there, but this was a bigger issue than could be dealt with on a local basis.
Another sort of regional area that was significant during Governor Burns' term and in your subsequent career was the Meadowlands. What do you recall about issues affecting the Meadowlands while you were still in the governor's office?
The biggest issue that we seemed to face when I was in the governor's office was the leadership at the New Jersey Sports Complex. It opened in '76, and almost immediately Sonny Werblin, who was both the chairman of the board and CEO, had problems with the governor, and then resigned and went to subsequently became the chairman of Madison Square Garden.
What were those problems?
I think it was really over her ability to have independence in running the organization. When Sonny left, Jack Crumpy took over. He had been had run racing. It was a very, very fine and capable person. He left after 9 months because he couldn't get the racing calendar changed. And Bob Harder took over, who had come from Madison Square Garden and was the general manager for the arena, or for the stadium. The arena was just being built. And the governor was concerned about his relationship with Harder. In fact, one day when we went to the Meadowlands, he asked me to arrange a private meeting with Bob Harder in an effort to improve his relationship with him. And I think that one of the things that had happened there was the authority was flush with its success in racing and forgot that their minutes are signed by the governor, and the governor didn't feel that he was particularly appreciated at the authority. When Bob Harder decided to accept an offer from John McMullen to go run the Houston Astrodome, I was going in for lunch. I had a sandwich in a bag, and I went in to have lunch with the governor, and Bill Highland was there. And Bill was the chairman of the authority at that time. And they started to laugh, and I asked them what they were laughing about, and they said, well, we were just talking about you. And the governor said, I got a real problem there because I took a lot of heat in between the appointment, the resignation of Jack Crumpy and the appointment of Bob Harder. And I really don't want to go through that again. Dick Coffey had made a big play to attempt to become the CEO of the Meadowlands. And the governor said to me, I really don't want to lose you, but if you're willing to go up there and take the job, we'll announce it tomorrow. So that evening, the governor, Jerry English, Harold Hodis, and I went to dinner in a little restaurant over in Pennsylvania on 202, and we discussed it. And I can remember having called my wife, Terry, before I left for dinner to tell her what the conversation was about. And I can remember her telling me afterwards she spent the whole time praying I would take the job because the salary was double what I was getting at the as chief of staff, and we had 3 kids in college at the time.
Did you have any reluctance at all?
I missed being chief of staff, but as I said to the governor many times, I think I answered the call for about 4 positions from him, and I just don't turn them down. And so they announced it the next day, and I went there on September 1st in 1979 and was there for 19 plus years.